Michael Martino has been in the business of pharma and biotech for many years, having launched his career with Mallinckrodt back in the early 80s. After a long run there, he served 10 years as president and CEO at oncology-focused Pharmaceuticals until its merger with Oncogenics in 2008. Then took the reins at protein design company Arzita, served as CEO at medtech company CareFusion prior to its acquisition by Becton Dickinson and Company, led Ambit Biosciences until its acquisition by Daiichi Sankyo, and spent nearly 7 years at the helm of Hemoflow Therapeutics before taking his current job as president and CEO at Ampio Pharmaceuticals in November of last year. For its part, Ampio is developing a novel biologic called Ampion, a blood-derived cyclized peptide and small molecule combo that leverages the immune response to address the underlying causes of inflammatory diseases impacting the joints, lungs, kidneys, and other organs. The therapy is in the midst of phase 3 clinical trials in osteoarthritis of the knee, with mid and early clinical programs in osteoarthritis of the hand, COVID, and acute respiratory distress syndrome, kidney disease, and pediatric disease following closely behind. I'm Matt Pillar. This is the Business of Biotech, and I'm here to welcome Michael to the show. Michael, welcome.
Thank you, Matt. My pleasure to be here.
It's our pleasure to have you. I'm excited about the conversation, and I want to start. I'm gonna want to get to know you a little bit better and talk a bit more about your background and what brought you to Ampio. But before we do, I want to jump right into the kind of the heart of this conversation around inflammation. I've had plenty of conversations in recent years with a whole bunch of C-level execs from biopharma companies who have had different opinions on inflammation, like what it is, why it is, what role it plays in disease. Many of them have migrated their view of inflammation from, symptomatic of any number of health conditions to perhaps contributory or even causal of any number of health conditions. So before we get into the specifics about the therapy you're developing, I'm just curious, like, what's the starting point for Ampio in terms of its perspective or point of view on what inflammation is?
Well, listen, I'm likely to disappoint you right up front here on the first question. I'm not a physician. I'm not a scientist.
Well, nor am I. So you can't disappoint me.
My view tends to be pretty simplistic, and I certainly wouldn't claim to be able to go toe to toe with the physicians and scientists that have really studied this, including those, by the way, in Ampio. Mm-hmm. So, my simplistic view starts with the textbook definition. Inflammation is an immune modulated response to trauma, injury, infection, illness, etc. And I think the evidence is really compelling that inflammation can directly lead or contribute to other very serious conditions. Diabetes, heart disease, cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, etc. So it really can be a root cause of much more serious conditions. Although if you're a patient suffering from KL4 osteoarthritis of the knee, it's or bone-on-bone disease in the knee, it's probably hard to imagine that things could get much more serious. But our view is that the way to deal with that is essentially at the transcriptional level. And that really gets into a discussion of Ampion, what it is, how we think it works, et cetera. But we certainly view inflammation as a progressive disease that not only can become very disabling for patients suffering from, for example, osteoarthritis in the knee, mm-hmm. But also can lead to other serious conditions.
Yeah, Ampio's been around for a while. 2008, I believe, was its founding date, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, that certainly predates me and my memory. So it has certainly been a while. That's correct.
Yeah, I'm just curious, to your knowledge, and again, fully acknowledging that you joined the company just last year in November. To your knowledge, has inflammation been a focus of the company since its inception?
It has. I joined the board in October along with Kevin Bucci, and I think both of us believed at the time that there was compelling evidence to suggest that Ampion is a real drug. We still believe that. Of course, my predecessor, Mike Macaluso, who's headed the company since its founding, is on medical leave. Yes, I think a transcriptional approach to addressing inflammation has been a consistent theme of the company.
Yeah. Well, good wishes to Mike, by the way. I hope all ends well for him.
Well, we certainly all join you in those wishes.
Yeah. So let's talk about the lead candidate then. Your lead candidate Ampion, is described by Ampio as a novel biologic drug containing a blood-derived cyclized peptide and small molecules that target multiple pathways in the innate immune response characteristic of inflammatory disease. So let's break. That's a long description with a bunch of sort of a bunch of clues in there as to what this therapeutic is. Let's break that down. Describe the therapy for us.
Sure. So let's start with the characterization of the product. It's actually a low molecular weight ultrafiltrate of 5% human serum albumin. So what does that mean? That means we start with medical grade sterile human serum albumin, and in a clean room environment using single-use sets, we progressively filtrate that human serum albumin to actually arrive at three active ingredients, a cyclized peptide and two small molecules. So it is derived from a blood product. There's actually only trace amounts of human serum albumin in the finished product. But albumin, human serum albumin, is the starting point. So it is classified as a biologic from a regulatory perspective.
Yep.
We believe that what our in vitro preclinical data supports or suggests, and we certainly believe we see this in our clinical trial results, is that Ampion acts by suppressing or downregulating inflammatory cytokines. So various things like TNF-alpha, IL-6, IL-10, and it actually upregulates certain healing proteins. And so specifically things like IL-12 and SOX9, which, by the way, is a potentially important observation. So we believe what we do is address inflammation by shifting transcription from the inflammation cascade to a healing, restructuring cascade.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I was going to ask you about the regulatory structure. So CBER is the regulatory authority then?
It is indeed. We are.
Mm-hmm. And given that there's a small molecule characteristic of the therapy, is there any involvement from other organizations within FDA, or does CBER handle your regulatory interactions on the small mole side as well?
It is the finished product is derived from human serum albumin. We don't add anything to it. So these are ingredients that exist in very small doses in human serum albumin. So all we're doing is filtrating it to, in effect, get a higher concentration of those molecules that we think are critical to the mechanism of action. So because we start with human serum albumin, it is regulated by CBER.
Gotcha. Okay. So it's interesting to me, just at a high level. I think it's fair to say that inflammatory disease as an indication has been dominated by small molecule therapies, right? It's been a small molecule proposition from my understanding, historically anyway, right? Like anti-inflammatory drugs. What is well, two questions. What's the thinking behind introducing a biologic element? And two, where does that put Ampion sort of in the competitive space for inflammatory therapeutics, specifically in indications like osteoarthritis?
Well, I think taking the the last part of the question first.
Mhm.
Our research, including pretty in-depth discussions with orthopedic surgeons and rheumatologists and the physicians that would actually treat patients with these conditions, is that they're actually very intrigued with the mechanism of action, which really addresses the underlying immunological drivers of inflammation. And I think that the mechanism of action and the results we're demonstrating are more important to the users than whether the drug is classified as a biologic or a small molecule.
Mhm.
Now, on the other hand, taking the first part of the question first, in effect, we are starting with a biologic source material and ending up with a small molecule drug.
Mhm.
And the reason, again, that it's classified and regulated as a biologic is because of the starting material. And we're very confident, and I think based on discussions to date, FDA is I want to say confident, but of course, I don't want to be making any claims until FDA officially says the product is approved.
Sure.
But I think relatively speaking, control and characterization of product is relatively low on our concern scale.
Mhm.
I think we have that pretty well addressed.
Okay. All right, good.
Now,
yep.
as I'm thinking about it, and, just freebasing here a little bit,
Sure.
usually the concern with a biologic versus a small molecule is the cost of the biologic process, right?
Mhm.
But in this case, again, what we're using is an ultrafiltration process, starting with medical grade sterile material in a clean room environment, and we're manufacturing it through multiple filtration steps. So we actually believe that our manufacturing process and the resulting cost of goods is a competitive advantage, even though the drug is classified as a biologic.
Well, that's I can see why you wanted to kind of freewheel there and make that point, because if you have a competitive differentiator in the biologic space, it's certainly a gong you want to bang on. So let's walk through in a little more detail that manufacturing process, starting with source materials. So again, we've ascertained that it's a blood derived product. Where do you source that starting material?
Oh, from an approved human serum albumin supplier.
Okay.
We really do believe that the manufacturing process is a competitive advantage. As you can imagine, that's protected as much, if not more, by trade secrets than it is by intellectual property, although we certainly have some process-related intellectual property in place. And so we actually are fairly guarded about discussing the specifics of the manufacturing process. I mean, certainly in partnering discussions, once a partner signs a confidentiality agreement, we open up on a number of points, including the manufacturing process. But what I can tell you is that it is entirely manufactured in a clean room environment, where we use multiple filtration steps to go from human serum albumin to this ultrafiltrate, which consists of the cyclized peptide and 3 small molecules. That is then filled in solution in a vial in a sterile environment and capped. And we then move into labeling and inspection before moving that out of the sterile environment into warehousing.
Yeah.
So it's, I think I can say with a fair amount of confidence that the people who have seen the process and witnessed it in action, are including myself and Kevin Bucci when we first saw it back in October, are fairly impressed with it.
Okay. Good. All right. So I'll ask you a few questions on that, and if you cannot disclose, just tell me you can't disclose.
Okay.
Or one of our esteemed PR colleagues listening on the call will certainly jump in and say, hey, you can't talk about that. But so clinical supply. I mean, you guys are in the throes of clinical activity, specifically with your osteoarthritis of the knee product. What kind of clinical supply, volume-wise, are you producing right now?
We've supported clinical supply 100% out of our manufacturing facility, and orders of magnitude comprising all the clinical studies to date, including the COVID studies, by the way. We've probably supplied approaching 8,000 vials in both 5 ml and 10 ml configuration, and orders of magnitude probably 300 to 400 135 ml IV bags that are used in the IV COVID trials. Now, I will say, we have said publicly that we believe the facility could support annual production of about 8 million vials.
Mm. So this is you speak of the facility that you own, the facility you're building your clinical supply in right now, and it's a facility that you run in-house.
That's correct.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's significant. When you mentioned, if you can disclose, you mentioned earlier, you do share some IP with partners when necessary. Are there elements of the manufacturing approach that are outsourced? Or are you talking about like consumables partners?
Well, I mean, of course, we outsource the raw materials, the human serum albumin, the vials, the caps, the IV bags, labels, et cetera. For clinical trials, we have had an outside CRO do the 3PL activities, warehousing, pick, pack, ship, control, et cetera. I think as we move forward, our strategy ideally would be to hold on to manufacturing and actually be the manufacturing supplier for a partner or partners in different parts of the world. Although most likely at that scale, we would have to rely on a 3PL partner to manage the logistics of that. I can't see us building out the warehouse space or building out the infrastructure, team, processes, systems, et cetera, to do that. There are people that do that distribute drugs through specialty pharmacies, which I believe, by the way, this drug would be distributed through. And it just doesn't make sense for us to try to replicate those investments.
Yeah. Why did it make sense for you to manufacture the therapy in-house, to build that capacity, build the, not only build or repurpose a building, but outfit it with the equipment necessary? Why make that investment as opposed to outsourcing?
Well, actually, the development of the manufacturing process went hand in hand with the development of the product itself. So it was really a natural extension of the IND, of the development work required to identify the product, characterize it, be able to reproducibly and predictably manufacture it, et cetera. And actually, the investment in the clean room environment, which is, again, designed as a modular unit with single-use filtration sets used to manufacture the product, was relatively modest. I mean, we're talking about sub $10 million. And actually, we believe we've learned enough through that process now where if, for example, strategically it was desirable, it became desirable to locate manufacturing facilities in other parts of the world from a logistical supply perspective, we believe we could do that for well under $10 million. Mm-hmm. So it's a very cost-effective manufacturing process.
Right. Perfect. Okay. You mentioned, did you say 8 million doses or 8 million vials of potential capacity right now?
8 million vials. Mm-hmm. Now, today, we believe that, I think we have fairly significant clinical data to support this, that a dose would be 1 5 ml vial.
Okay.
So, you can effectively draw about 4 mLs out of a 5 ml vial. Mm-hmm. And that is the dose used in our 2 phase 3 clinical trials.
Okay. How does that 8 million figure align with the potential market demand should you make it to the finish line and commercialize this product? I mean, it's a huge, as we ascertained, it's a, it's a big patient population. So kind of how does that math kind of shake out in terms of the market opportunity?
Yeah, we believe that without making any commercial forecast here that I'm sure Scott and Nick would object to at this point. Yeah. We believe the market opportunity here is in excess of $1 billion globally. And the 8 million vials we think certainly is sufficient to support global launch. And actually, the limiting factor at launch today is thinking our way through the 3PL inventorying, warehousing, logistics capabilities, and we are in the process of thinking our way through that, but don't have all the answers in place today. Sure. So we wouldn't have to think about a manufacturing capacity investment for a couple of years post-launch, although I think together with a partner it would be prudent, given lead times, to begin thinking about that in the next 12 months or so.
Okay. That last mile beyond the 3PL challenge that you're going to hammer out here in short order. Tell us about that. What is the administration of the therapeutic look like out there in the wild in a commercial setting? Is this, you said specialty pharma. Are we talking about self-administration, or is this a clinical setting?
Ideally not self-administration. I mean,
okay.
Finding the intra-articular space in the knee, so the product is injected in.
Yeah, that hurts. Hurts just to think. Yeah.
Yeah. Really requires a trained physician, and typically would use something like a 21 gauge needle to make that injection. So the product is provided in the 5 ml vial. All the physician would do is draw it into a syringe and inject it into the right place in the knee.
Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect. Yeah, I guess I wasn't clear on the injection site and method. My son, actually, he's 17 now, but when he was a little bit younger, he suffered juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, and we self-administered methotrexate for quite some time, until he recovered from JRE or JRE, that is. And I just remember making the big fat pinch in his thigh, as fat as I could on his skinny little body, and just popping that needle in the thigh. So that was difficult enough for a parent to do, but going into right into the joint. No, thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm sure the injection in the thigh left memories for both of you. But no, this is, I think this is a little trickier.
Sure. Yep. Okay. All right. You mentioned that you didn't want to divulge too much in terms of commercial or market opportunity because you didn't want to make the PR police nervous. I'm going to ask you a couple questions that are sure to make the PR police nervous. I'm going to ask them anyway, though.
Okay.
And I'll ask them confidently because because these things predate you. But it doesn't take too much research on Ampio to kind of run into problems that every emerging biotech, clinical stage biotech runs into, but that few are willing to talk about. One being there was some financial turbulence for the company there not too long before you joined. And there was an FDA setback that made a little bit of a splash in the news. I wouldn't say it was a big splash, but it made a little bit of splash in the news when the FDA proposed some modifications to your special protocol assessment for late stage study of Ampion in that osteoarthritis of the knee trial. So just, I guess, address those, because I feel like we ought to, and tell me how the company, and maybe even in particular you, since you joined last year, have navigated away from those. I don't even want to call them setbacks. We'll call them challenges.
Right. Well, clearly for many, many small companies, access to capital has been a challenge. And to address that, we made the decision in December that frankly was unpopular with some investors at the time. And hopefully in retrospect, they see the the wisdom of it. But we would have been running out of cash with the cash on the balance sheet at the time in about the middle of this year. We did believe that market conditions were going to continue to be tough for small biotechs. We didn't believe that we'd be able to hit any meaningful value inflection points in the near term. So we made the tough decision in December to raise capital. And, the terms were tough. It was a 10% discount to market. It was 15% warrant coverage. Again, it was not a popular move with a number of investors, but, sitting here today, we can say we have the cash to operate into the second half of 2023, which we believe gives us significant breathing room and optionality to continue to pursue two key objectives. One is agreement with FDA that AP13 is a viable second confirmatory phase 3 trial to support a BLA. And then second, based on that clarity, to negotiate a partnership or partnerships that put us in a position to continue to develop the product and commercialize it. So, that was a question of, listen, I'm a firm believer that the obstacle is the way. You can't navigate away from most of them. You have to confront them. Now, with regard to FDA, my sense is that the company took the same approach before I joined in terms of addressing the obstacle directly instead of trying to avoid it, which was to clearly understand FDA's comments, their needs, and to do our best to build those into the trial. Now, most recently, of course, significant disruption was the effect the COVID-19 pandemic had on right in the middle of AP13, this second trial.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure you're going to want to discuss that in more detail, but that disruption is something that we are attempting to manage by recognizing and responding to FDA guidance on how to deal with that, how to mitigate that. And we have in fact proposed what's called a modified intent to treat efficacy population for purposes of assessing efficacy in AP13. And FDA's agreement with that is essential to moving that trial forward.
Mm-hmm.
We've announced that we submitted a meeting request at the end of January. FDA responded to that actually very promptly with a commitment to provide written answers to our questions, which is their operating mode through this pandemic. We've submitted a detailed briefing package, and we've said that we expect to have clarity on that by the end of the first half of this year. And I think we're on track to do that. I'm cautiously optimistic. You probably haven't interviewed many CEOs on your podcast who are pessimistic by nature.
No.
So I'm cautiously optimistic, but of course, FDA presumably is in the process of doing their analysis, and we really have to wait to hear their answers.
When you're striving to excel in a new arena, the best guides are the ones already doing it well. The Business of Biotech brings those voices forward to help new and emerging biopharmas turn their innovations, like mRNA and cell and gene therapies, into clinical realities. Tune in and subscribe for insights on hiring, regulatory, and other need-to-know topics for biopharma leaders. The podcast is brought to you in collaboration with Cytiva. Check out their resources at cytiva.com/emerging biotech. That's CYTIVA.com/emerging biotech. Okay, well, good. That was a more thorough answer than I expected. So thank you for that. Yeah, and I do want to talk a little bit about the COVID impact. Because it's interesting. The COVID impact for Ampio has been certainly it's created some challenges, but it's also created some opportunities, and we'll talk about those here in a minute. I mean, you've got a clinical trial going on right now that is a direct result of COVID. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But as I listen to you respond to my question about the way I phrased it, navigating away from some challenges. And I like the way that you spun that around and said, look, we don't navigate away from the challenges. We climb obstacles, right? Like that's, so I'm getting a sense of your sort of leadership style. And you've got a lot of experience, as I stated from the outset. I don't mean to age you here, Mike, but
well, you put that very kindly, Matt. Thank you.
Well, by all means, you look terrific. For a guy that launched his career back in the early 80s, but you served in a lot of C-level capacity since then too. Like you've got a lot of leadership under your belt. A guy of your stature who's been around the industry for quite a while and had so many great positions can go a lot of places with that. So I'm curious about your decision to move into Ampio. Like what led you there? I gather you were on the board. Did you tell me that earlier that you were on the board?
Yeah, I had joined the board in October, and I was approached with that opportunity by a good friend and colleague who's actually in the financial industry. We've known each other for over 30 years, worked on a number of projects together, and he thought it was a very interesting opportunity. And, after some study, I agreed with that and then learned that Kevin Bucci was also joining the board. And my comment to the board was, between the two of us, Kevin was the far better catch. A very, very experienced guy, financially, strategically, operationally, from a deal perspective. And then again, I think having the leadership vacuum at the company as a result of Mike Macaluso's absence was unplanned, unforeseen. But really believed at that point in time that there was an opportunity here that presented three things that I've always looked for in career steps. First is the opportunity to contribute to something that would be meaningful. Mm-hmm. Second is the opportunity to learn something new. And finally, it was the opportunity to work with people that I not only respected, but liked and would enjoy working with. On the first point, contribution, I do believe that bringing some focus and some discipline, drug development, mindsets and philosophies and approaches is something that the company needed. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about the COVID trials. Secondly, inflammation and pain is a new area for me. Most of my career has been spent in the development of oncology drugs. And while inflammation and pain are certainly matters of interest in developing oncology drugs, they aren't the primary focus. So there clearly has been an opportunity to learn a new space here. And then finally, I think this is a lean, young, aggressive team that I enjoy being around, that energizes me. So those are the three factors that led me to say, yeah, I'll step in and try to contribute here.
Excellent. Yeah, all obviously good reasons. And, as I said, after the experience that you've amassed, you probably don't make these decisions lightly. You know what you're looking for. And it sounds like it was a great step. I want to hit rewind and go way back just to get a perspective on this. When you came out of college, if I'm not mistaken, you were a business guy, maybe business or finance. You have an MBA?
Yeah, I have an MBA. I'm a business guy.
Business undergrad and an MBA, and then bam, right into pharmaceutical industry, biopharma. Why? Like, and you stayed there. Like, effectively, you stayed there. Your entire career. What was it? Was it just an opportunity? Was it a strategy? What was the motivating factor there?
Maybe I'm just a slow learner. This industry certainly isn't for the faint of heart. Joining Mallinckrodt was happenstance for me. It was a great happenstance. I was coming out of an MBA program. I really wasn't sure how I wanted to apply that. And a mentor just suggested that this was a field that was important, that it was doing things that would make real contributions to society, and that it was likely to be a growth area for a long period of time. Mallinckrodt was one of these Midwestern companies. If I recall all the history correctly, founded in something like 1850. Was the first major chemical company west of the Mississippi River. At the time I joined, it had exactly 3 CEOs in its history. And I joined when the 4th was in place. So it was just a solid company with some outstanding product franchises and some really basic fundamental values and processes and ways of looking at problem solving that frankly have pretty much stayed with me my entire career. I was very fortunate to have people there who mentored me even when I didn't deserve it. And as a result of that, was able to get a lot of experience in the 16 or 17 years that I spent there.
Yeah, that's a long run for sure. Especially by today's standards, I think maybe in the 80s, early 90s, it was maybe a little more, a little more common to see a run that long, but that's quite a, you don't go into a new opportunity saying, well, I can't really demonstrate my commitment to a job. You had that going for you. All right, so let's get back to back to the company and that COVID point that you mentioned. The pandemic, when it struck, you guys suffered the same challenges, I think, that pretty much any biopharma did, and probably continue to, regarding supply chain constraints and consumables and that kind of thing. But you also struck pretty quickly with some respiratory disease candidates. COVID with acute respiratory distress syndrome, and COVID long hauler. I think 3 different candidates there. So, not by chance. I mean, you joined the company in the throes of the pandemic. So tell me a little bit about that. You come in. Were those candidates in place already at that point when you joined the company? How did it sort of come to pass? And describe, I guess, the clinical momentum on those candidates.
Right. So I think really, Matt, I'd like to talk about COVID on 2 dimensions. The first is the impact it had on the OAK program, because that's really what led to the efforts in the respiratory distress part of the COVID pandemic. We initiated the second pivotal trial, AP13, in OAK in June of 2019. And the plan was to enroll about 1,037 patients, randomized 1-to-1, drug versus control. I won't get into all the details. But the final efficacy readout was at the 12-week follow-up visit in the clinic. And so we started enrolling in June of 2019. In January of 2020, we started hearing about this thing called COVID-19. In February and March, both the president and the CDC declared a public health emergency. So how did that impact the trial? Well, you need to understand that for the most part, COVID-19 OAK patients are older. I believe the median age in our trial was in the 60s. They have multiple underlying conditions. In addition to osteoarthritis, they are likely overweight. They likely have some level of diabetes. They likely have some level of respiratory distress, or at least respiratory challenges, i.e., they were right in the target area of what CDC was saying were high-risk patients for COVID.
Yeah.
Additionally, you need to understand that the nature of osteoarthritis is that while it's very painful for the people that have it, treating it's considered an elective procedure.
Yeah.
Right. So what happened to us smack dab in the middle of this trial is that the 12-week efficacy visits were disrupted and they were disrupted because we had sites that just closed their orthopedic practices. We had sites who refused to let patients in for the 12-week efficacy visits because it was an elective procedure. And we had patients, by the way, who were scared to death to go into the hospital or into the clinic to have those follow-up visits. So as a result, we had a significant amount of missing data, and specifically missing data related to our ability to do the statistical analysis on efficacy in that trial.
Yeah. Let me, before you go on, Mike, let me backpedal just 1 minute. Cause I started this question out by saying, like every other biotech company, Ampio had some struggles during, the pandemic, blah, blah, blah. Well, that was severely understated given the story that you just told. You guys, it's funny how an event that impacts the entire world can impact some companies far more acutely based on where they are on some continuum, right? Some life cycle. And in this case, the continuum of a clinical trial. You were like, you had to be like, oh, that was bad timing. This was just bad timing.
Well, I mean, it was bad timing. And of course, no one could foresee that timing. And I'm not claiming that it didn't also impact clinical trials in other drug development areas like oncology or heart disease, but arguably, the drugs being developed in those areas are life-saving medicines. So I believe that the pandemic did impact the clinical development less, although there were clearly challenges that they had to overcome as well. So, Matt, to make a long story short on this, what we have proposed to FDA following their guidelines is a modified intent to treat efficacy population where we only have about 7% missing data in that population versus a population that was heavily impacted by COVID where we have about 70% missing data. And we have done that by following FDA guidelines and applying a calendar cutoff date that is still objective, preserves randomization, et cetera. So we believe that the modified intent to treat population is a valid basis for assessing the efficacy and safety of the drug. And again, we need FDA to agree to that. Now, during this period, there was a 6 or 8 month delay where this trial was essentially on pause. And if you remember back during that period of time, we were still going through the peaks and valleys of spikes in incidence of disease and death rates. And so it was very difficult to figure out what we were going to do with this, with the trial. I think the initial philosophy was let's wait it out. And then it became clear very quickly that we weren't going to wait it out. We went through some exercises to attempt to determine if patients could be monitored remotely. Frankly, only 1 or 2 of our 25 or 26 sites said they had the capability and or the inclination to do that. So that wasn't an answer to the problem. We had several conversations with FDA over that period of time, in addition to their public guidances to industry on how to deal with COVID disruptions to clinical trials. But essentially, we were on hold for 6 to 8 months.
Yeah.
And, I retrospect is a very comfortable position to be in. I would say philosophically, I've been around this enough to know or to believe that small companies have to be, on the one hand, strategically focused, on the other hand, strategically opportunistic. And we really do believe that the mechanism of action of Ampion could lend itself to the treatment of respiratory-related infections. We believe that. Mm-hmm. At the time, also, FDA was, in attempting to get out ahead of this disease, was handing out a lot of emergency medical use authorizations to drugs that had promise. But there was still a clinical trial or a clinical data hurdle for getting those emergency medical use authorizations. So based on the belief and lab data that Ampion could effectively treat respiratory distress associated with COVID. The company did do 2 pilot studies initially, and then expanded that to 3 studies. One with IV administered Ampion in the hospital to treat respiratory distress associated with COVID, and looking specifically at delays to death and/or mechanical ventilation in those patients. One looking at inhaled Ampion in the inpatient population, and one looking at inhaled Ampion in what's called the long COVID population in the home setting. Mm-hmm. So we have reached the final enrollment point, and those studies were initiated before I joined the company.
Okay.
So we've reached predetermined either final in one case or interim enrollment rates in 2 cases in those trials. And we're in the process of analyzing the data. And what we've said publicly is that in AP17, so the IV trial in inpatients with COVID, is simply not demonstrating enough of a clinical signal at this point to continue that trial, and especially with current difficulties in enrolling COVID patients. And I can elaborate on that in a minute. The other 2 trials are still in evaluation. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to prejudge the data. If we see signals there, we would certainly continue to be opportunistic in pursuing those. Based upon what I know today, at the same time, I'm not opportunistic that we're going to see the signal. Mm-hmm. But here's what I believe based upon what we know today. Number one, I believe that we have demonstrated that Ampion can be administered safely via both IV administration and via inhalation, for example, with a nebulizer. And those are important things for us to know going forward. Number 2, while we aren't seeing the specific clinical endpoints that we expected in those trials, we are seeing at least subclinical benefits, which lead us to be opportunistic that there may well yet be a respiratory distress or respiratory inflammation application for this product. And that simply requires us to get the data from the outstanding trials, frankly, probably to do some more preclinical work to really understand what the application could be. But I believe, the reason you do experiments is because you don't know the answer. And these experiments weren't wasted. I think we're going to learn a significant amount from them, even if the data turns out, as I suspect, not to support continuation of these 3 specific trials.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's understood, right? I mean, you perhaps might not have attempted the test had you not been tested by COVID itself. So, it sometimes takes those forced plays to find new opportunity. Go ahead. Were you going to say something?
No, I was going to say at the same time, I think part of the strategic focus and discipline that I bring is Ampio is a 20-person company today. Mm-hmm. And we certainly are taking advantage of key opinion leaders and expert consultants in the relative areas to help us get this done. But treatment of pain and severe osteoarthritis of the knee patients is an enormous opportunity. Mm-hmm. Being able to expand the market from the knee to the shoulder and the hip, for example, is probably 1.5 to 2x that opportunity.
Right.
And that is plenty enough opportunity with the data we have to suggest to us that we have a safe drug with evidence of efficacy to really focus first and foremost on that opportunity. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not to say that we aren't continuing to do research in other areas, but it's much more focused. And I certainly won't hesitate to discontinue those COVID trials if the data suggest that the likely return isn't sufficient to make the investment.
Right. Yeah. Well, we're we're running short on time here, Mike, and so I need to move on. But you're on the cusp of some moves, right? I mean, you're getting close to hearing back from the FDA, late stage clinicals with the Oak program. We'll be paying attention. We'll be rooting along with you, and hopefully, once the ball moves a little bit further downfield, we'll have you back on and talk about your successes. Before I let you go, though, there is a point on your CV, if you will, on your resume that I have to ask you about. Being a rural Pennsylvania guy myself, when I see someone I'm going to talk to has some sort of a agrarian connection, I got to ask about it. So there's like this 6-year period in your professional history that overlaps your time spent with I think it was with Hemoflow, where you were owner operator at Fruteto di Martino, a grower of mandarin, oranges, and avocados. Your company, I'm assuming, given the name.
The name was actually suggested by a sister-in-law. I have to tell you that we just happened into that as well. We were searching for a house out of San Diego proper that didn't have the city congestion and had a little more room. We fell in love with a house that just happened to come along with about 170, 180 avocado trees and 3 dozen orange trees.
No kidding.
So we were under California and federal law considered a small grower. I would tell you that what I learned is, number one, farming, even on a small scale, is hard work.
Yeah.
And I think farmers have well-deserved reputations for being outstanding business people, really understanding supply, demand, currency fluctuations, imports, exports, wholesale versus retail pricing trends. I learned enough to know that I'm not one, and I have a high respect for them.
Well, that's cool. Did you? So you actually did treat it as a business, as a small. It wasn't sort of a hobby farm. It was you were in it.
It was a revenue business, more in some years than in others, but it was something that I actively farmed myself for the first couple of years. Got a little bit of help later on, but we harvested the fruit and sold it to wholesalers who took it the rest of the way through the chain to consumers.
Yeah, well, that's very neat. Cool experience. Do you maintain any semblance of a green thumb post Fruteto di Martino?
Well, I'm not sure I ever had a green thumb, and if you have time, I want to share an anecdote with you. We had moved in here and we thought, great, we have avocados. So we had guests coming over for lunch one day, and we were going to serve the avocados. And this was shortly after moving in. And I promptly discovered that avocados don't ripen till you pick them from the tree. So we had avocados that looked good that were pretty hard.
Yeah.
So we had to run to the grocery store, and I was peeling the grown in California labels off the avocados. Our guests were arriving in the driveway. I'm not sure I can claim to ever have been much of a farmer.
That's an excellent story. You know what it does, Michael? It demonstrates your honesty and transparency. The fact that you would share that story with the world. Hopefully your guests at that dinner party aren't listening.
Well, we at the end of the dinner, when they were raving about how the avocados tasted, we did confess.
You fessed up. Very good. Well, Michael, we are out of time. We've got to run, but I'm gonna give you one. I'll give you the last word. Just share with us. I mean, obviously, as we said, we know that there's some big news coming for Ampio. But from your perspective, what's the next big move for you as CEO?
Well, I mean, clearly the next big move and a catalyst point is clarity from FDA. I believe with that clarity, we'll be in a position to move forward and conclude one or more partnerships that bring us expertise, commercial capabilities, and yes, hopefully some additional cash. And moving forward from there to submit the BLA and get it approved. And in parallel, also working to begin expanding application of the drug from the knee to other joints. And in closing, I really want to also talk about our ongoing R&D efforts, which I'm not prepared to expand on today, except to say that the team is working hard. I'm really pleased with the progress they're making on focused programs. And I think Ampion is in its current form. It is not the only product, certainly not the last product that we'll have in our pipeline.
Well, great. You heard it here first. There's more to come from Ampio, and thank you for, again, your transparency, your honesty. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. Learned quite a bit, and I'm a new fan. I'll be pulling for you guys.
Thank you, Matt. Well, I'll take that.
So that's Ampio Pharmaceuticals Chairman and CEO Michael Martino. I'm Matt Pillar, and this is the Business of Biotech. We're produced by Bioprocess Online with a great partner in Cytiva, a company that stands by its commitment to new and emerging biopharma and demonstrates that commitment at cytiva.com/emerging biotech. Check that out. Check us out at bioprocessonline.com, where I invite you to subscribe to my newsletter. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please subscribe, give us 5 stars. And as always, thanks for listening.